So I was, as Freddie said, I'd sort of come over here today from Ireland, and it's been a long time since I was in London. Actually, my family are Londoners, going back many generations, but it's been a long time since I lived here or worked here or anything like that, and every time I come back it's bigger and shinier and faster. So I feel a bit like a country bumpkin these days. And so I was coming in, I had to fly in from Shannon, which is a very nice little airport because there's hardly anyone in it, especially on a Sunday morning. It's really good. It's the only kind of airport I like. Feels like travel probably was about 50 years ago. So I was coming in and then I had to get on the Gatwick Express, and it's been a long time since I was on a British train, so I remember the glories of the British rail network, so that was nice. So then I was starting to feel a bit grumpy, and everything was fast and noisy and smelly, and I felt, like I said, a bit like a hick, and I sort of wanted to be in my garden, and I was thinking maybe I've done the wrong thing here. I wonder if I could get away with just turning around. But then I got here and I had to walk down Victoria Street, and there were all these huge glass things and tents on the pavement, which I'd never seen. Last time I was in London there weren't tents on the pavement. Anyway, I was walking down here, and then on the right I saw this great big church, and I thought it was an Orthodox church, it had a big dome. And I thought, I need to go in there. So I went in there, and of course it was Westminster Cathedral, turns out. It's been a long time since I was in London. So it was Westminster Cathedral. I went in there, and then the Mass was going on, actually. And it was just the Eucharist was just happening. The body and the blood of Christ were just there. And huge place, obviously, you probably know it. And so I just watched that. I was just in there for 10 minutes. And I was just looking around at all these people, so many different types of people from all over the world there. Different ages and races and creeds, and I just thought I was probably brought in here for a reason. It made me feel much happier. So I went in there, and then I thought I better get down to UnHerd or Freddie's going to get cross. So I came outside. I've never seen Freddie cross, so I didn't really want to. So I came outside, and the first thing you see when you come out of Westminster Cathedral is this enormous glass sort of armadillo building, huge, horrible thing, with the big water stones in it. It's like the Temple of Mammon, right opposite the Temple of God. It's very symbolic. And actually that's what I want to talk about. So that was an appropriate moment. So we were asked to do this seminar with this question, what do we do when there's nothing left to conserve? Which is an interesting question. And the answer to the question probably depends on what you were trying to conserve in the first place, what you think conservation means. And in a country like this, which has been kind of at the spear tip of the modern revolution for hundreds of years, there isn't much left. There isn't much left that the likes of, say, Edmund Burke would consider worth conserving, I don't think. We have this process here and across the world that I've called elsewhere a great unsettling. This great sort of tearing up by the roots of almost everything. So I thought, what would people be trying to conserve? And there are a lot of people around at the moment trying to conserve or defend this thing called the West, right? We all want to defend the West or conserve the West. And the notion that the West is in decline, or it's collapsing, or it's dying, or it's even committing suicide is reaching a kind of a crescendo everywhere. All these kind of chickens of modernity that the West created and unleashed into the world are all coming home to roost back here. So maybe we're talking about conserving the West. But then if you want to conserve the West, you have to know what it is. So what is this West? West of what? Why are we talking about that? And I thought, if you want to talk about the West or conserving the West or the culture of the West, whatever that even is, you have to tell a story about it. You have to revisit the origin story of the West. And going back into that church made me think about that. And you all know the origin story of the West. It's a good story. Like all the stories, it begins in a garden, right? You have a garden at the beginning of time. And in this garden, you have everything that's alive. You have the humans, they're the most recent thing that's been created, and you have all the animals and all the birds and everything else. And you have a plant-based diet in the garden as well. It's very contemporary. There's no carnivorous activity in the garden. And you have the creator of all things, the creator of this garden. He's in the garden as well, and he's walking around, and you can see him walking in the garden in the cool of the evening, which is a great image. So everything's in communion with everything in this garden. And at the centre of this garden, there's a tree. It's amazing how many origin stories from all different cultures have a tree at the centre of a garden. And so this tree is the tree of life. But there's another tree in the garden. The tree of life imparts life. And then there's this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, whatever that is. And these humans, the last thing to be created, are wandering around in this garden, and They're not ready to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil yet, because when God creates things in 6 days, at the end of each day, it says in the book of Genesis, he saw that it was good. He created the trees and he saw that it was good. He created the animals, he saw that it was good. When he created the humans, he didn't see that it was good. Interestingly enough, it's the one of the 2 days where he doesn't see that his creation is good. Because the humans aren't really complete. That's why we're not ready to eat from the tree, I think. If we start eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil where we're still kind of adolescents, we get into trouble. I think we're sort of being prepared for something. So anyway, you have these humans wandering around in this garden, and the Creator says, don't eat the fruit. Whatever you do, don't eat that thing there. So being humans, of course, we know what happens next because we kind of do it every day. Don't eat that thing there. Along comes this little animal, this snaky thing. And the snaky thing says, well, he's just, he's having you on. Why should you listen to him anyway? Why shouldn't you avail yourself of this? Oh, here comes the dog, see? Dog's bored already. So the snake says, why shouldn't you have the power of this tree? Why shouldn't you have the knowledge of good and evil? Why should this Creator keep it all for himself? Why should you listen to him? He just wants to keep you down. Eat the fruit, it's your right, you're worth it. So we eat the fruit. And as soon as you eat the fruit, you have this knowledge of what you are, it seems. You have suddenly all this symbolic thought enters, and you've noticed you haven't got any clothes on, and you notice that you're separate suddenly from everything else. And there's a separation between you and the rest of creation, and you and the Creator as well, and then the humans have to leave the garden. Can't be in there anymore. So we're on earth, and the earth is a broken version of the garden. The earth has death in it, and the earth has soil being broken and seeds being planted. We have to fight off predators. There's pain in childbirth, there's death, there's all of this stuff. And on the earth we start building cities, we start building towers, we start with the metalwork, we get into civilization, technological civilization as a result of the fall from the garden. So we forget the Creator, we worship ourselves and all the things we can do. This is happening all the time. So after a while the Creator takes pity and the Creator stages an intervention. Okay? He stages an intervention. He comes to earth in human form to show us the way back home. What do? Well, we're human, so we torture and kill him. But the joke's on us because then he's back again. 3 days later, and he's got something to tell us. And this thing he's telling us is that the Creator's way is not the way of power and technology and civilization. It's the way of humility. It's not conquest, it's sacrifice. And if you want to follow the path that he tells you to follow, you can come back into communion again and you can become holy. And the word holy comes from an Old English word halig, which means whole. So to be holy is to be whole again, which is what you were supposed to be in the first place. So that's the story. That's the origin story of this thing called the West. Now, then you have to imagine that a whole culture is built around this story and that this culture survives for over 1,000 years and it builds layer upon layer of meaning on this story. And then you imagine that the culture dies off and behind the culture is left only ruins. You don't have to imagine it because that's where you live. Right, that's what this is. This is the post-Christian West. These are the ruins of this thing called Christendom, which lasted for about 1,500 years in the West. And the historian Christopher Dawson, who wrote a great history of the Western Church, he said there's no reason to talk about anything called the West at all, unless you're simply talking about the domain of the Western Christian Church, that is to say the Catholic Church. That's what it is. That's why it's called the West. The only thing that unites all of these warring tribes, all these ethnicities and cultures and nations all battling each other and slaughtering each other for 1,000 years across the continent is this church, however imperfectly it unites them. So that's the sacred story. And every culture has a sacred story at the heart of it. Every culture everywhere directs its gaze towards where the divine can be found or where it thinks the divine can be found. Something it took me about 40 years to understand. So that's, I think, what you have to understand if you're going to talk about conserving something or restoring something or returning to something. If you want to defend the West, for example, you're talking about defending Christendom and the values that came from it, or the post-Christian liberal culture that came out of Christendom after the Enlightenment, which is still based on the values that that sacred story gives you. Now, you can dislike all of those values and have no interest in that religion, if you like, but it's still the origin story of this place. So every culture's got a sacred core. And when you take your eyes off the sacred core, you start looking at something else. That's what happened in the garden. G.K. Chesterton had an argument with Marx about this. He said the truth is that irreligion is the opium of the people. Because wherever the people do not believe in something beyond the world, They will worship the world. And above all, they will worship the strongest thing in the world. That's what you do. That's what we do. So there's a lot of people these days, it seems to me, who want to talk about defending the West, who are still trying to worship the strongest thing in the world. When they talk about defending the West, they're often talking about defending capitalism, which has done more to destroy culture and values in the West than any other system ever. Or maybe they're trying to defend free speech or individualism or the right to be rude on the internet. But those things themselves are a sort of result of the settlement that was designed to replace Christendom. And that settlement is known as the Enlightenment, right? Rather pompously. And that is designed to replace this original origin story with another origin story, a human-centered one this time. And this is, maybe you'd call this the liberal settlement, a bit of an overused word, but this settlement assumes that humans are disaggregated individuals who can roam the world speaking freely and consuming freely and imposing this kind of rational, science-based order on the world, and that leads to progress. And this combines the moral values of Western Christianity and the universalism, because Christianity is universal, with this kind of individualism and a faith in science and technology. And it brings this new origin story which replaces the one about the garden and the snake. And this one tells us that we were saved from superstition and ignorance by the holy trinity of modernity, reason, science and technology. And we stopped believing all the silly stories about gods and monsters, which we only believed when we didn't know anything else. And we faced the bracing reality that the universe is a meaningless swirl of matter energy, which came from nothing for no reason, and humans are just gene-replicating machines. So that's a nice story, isn't it? So we're post-religious man now, because we don't have time for that anymore. Now, I sort of grew up believing that story, I suppose. Probably lots of us did. Sort of taken me a long time to get away from it, but I don't believe it anymore. Don't think I've believed it for a long time, but I didn't know what I believed instead. But what I believe now is that in a significant sense, everything is religious. In a really fundamental sense, everything is religious. Now, I became a Christian 2 or 3 years ago, which was extremely unexpected and initially unwanted. I felt like C.S. Lewis wrote about this, about refusing to face the gaze of being endlessly stalked by the gaze of this thing that he really didn't want to see. It feels a bit like that. But anyway, I became a Christian, an Orthodox Christian, after many, many years of searching through any number of different faiths and systems and philosophies. And I've written about that in a few places, so I won't talk about it much. But the immersion in the Christian story, the understanding, especially in the Eastern Christian story, because in the East things have been conserved that haven't been conserved in the West, gave me actually a clearer sense, I think, of what's happening around us now, and a conversation around these notions of conservation and culture and all of this stuff. And what I really came to see, we can talk about this later, we can argue about this later, it would be an interesting conversation, is that I think there's a sacred underpinning to all human culture. As I said just now, I do think, Marx claims that the history of all hitherto existing society is a history of class struggle. I think it's a history of religious belief, or maybe religious experience, or religious immersion, or something. But the more I've kind of attended the divine liturgy in an Orthodox church, I've realised that what I dismissed as silly superstition was actually the stuff of life. And I've also realised that the notion of religion is a modern idea. It's an Enlightenment idea. The notion that there's a thing called religion that you sort of do on a Sunday morning isn't how anyone in the pre-modern West would ever have seen the world, and it's not how most people in the world today would see the world either. There's no notion that this framing story, this giant truth, this understanding of the universe can just be sort of siloed off as something that you do at the weekend. It's like assuming that gravity or the roundness of the earth are things that you only engage with on a Sunday morning. It's a way of seeing. It's an understanding of what life is, rightly or wrong. So when you take that out, you've taken out something really big from the foundations of the world you're living in. So again, everything is religious. This notion of religion as a separate thing is a very modern idea. And actually, there's only a few people in the world who believe that there's a thing called religion, which is separate from real life and secular modern life, and that's kind of us in the West. In Western Europe especially, but also in America. But in Western Europe is by a long way the least religious and spiritually inclined place in the world. In fact, the most religious part of Britain is this city, largely because it's got quite a lot of recent arrivals from more religious places who are bringing religion to the heathen English. Now, we used to think, I think, that I was told this at school, that by abolishing religion, we'd got beyond it in this very Richard Dawkinsy way. We got ahead of the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is going to catch up. I don't think that looks like such a good story anymore. It doesn't look like such a good bet for winner of the end of history board game at this point. If it's true that a human being is essentially a religious animal at a very deep level, then that would make sense, because no society that doesn't have a religious foundation can actually last. No society that doesn't have a sense of where this divine centre is can actually last. It will go mad, in fact, which is kind of what I think is happening. So, if everything's religious, the old religion's dead, or at least we've walked away from it, and the thing we tried to replace it with, which is this kind of rational, secular human progress, is sort of failing as well, because it doesn't meet the deeper needs of people. Where do you end up? Well, a good person to ask is René Guénon, perennialist French thinker René Guénon. The new king is a big fan of René Guénon. Guénon was a Frenchman, became a Muslim, migrated to Egypt, and wrote a lot of books trying to save the West from its own materialism. And he predicted that in the early 21st century, and assuming something big didn't change, which it didn't, the West would enter this thing he called the reign of quantity. And the reign of quantity is an age of pure materialism. Everything's quantified, subject to scientific assessment and technological management and rationalisation. And Guénon said that in the reign of quantity, religious feeling would become quantitative as well, because all we could do was engage with things on this measurable material level. So humanity can't shake off its religious impulse. We always have this desire for transcendence, this desire to go beyond. But we channel it into something material instead. So instead of having this untouchable, mysterious, numinous thing outside creation or woven through creation, you have the force of will, humanity, material things, become the object of worship. As Chesterton said, if you don't worship something outside the world, you worship the strongest thing in the world. And I think that's where we are. So the religious impulse is manifesting in material form, mainly through the use of technology to promote the human will and the human desire. And that's what I've been writing about for the last couple of years in a sort of very stumbling way. And Freddie says I can't be put into a box. It's because I don't know what I'm doing, really. I'm flailing around trying to work out what's going on. And there aren't any boxes, actually, that can contain what's happening. So this is the thing I call the machine. And the machine is a material manifestation of the human desire for liberation through technology. So the kind of liberation we wanted in the garden, we still want it, but we're going to make it ourselves now. All forms will be dissolved in favour of the final and only sovereign, which is the independent, rational individual, freed from the obligations of history and community and nature. Now, in the Orthodox Christian worldview, every human is an icon of God. We're all made in God's image. So humanity is made in the image of the Creator, and even though we endlessly fail to live up to all of that, you still have a clear point of reference. We know what humans are and what the world is, right? Every sacred story, every religion will give you a story that says, this is what you are, this is what humans are, this is what the world is, this is the purpose of it. Once that goes, as Dostoevsky said, without God, everything's permitted. What's the still point of the turning world? There isn't one. Or at least no one can agree on it, because the still point of the turning world is just you, wherever you happen to think. And since consumer liberalism has taught us that all desire is good, and we should valorize it, and surrender to it immediately, and then use it to sell things, then reality becomes open to endless redefinition, which is, again, I think, kind of where we are. Nobody can say what's right or wrong or real or agree on anything at all. Now, if you go back to the founding story of the Old West, the old Christian West, back to the garden, what does the current state of things look like from that perspective? I think it looks, and it would look like this to a medieval Christian, I think it would look like we were not following the path of the Creator, we were following the path of the snake, following the thing the serpent told us to do. You won't die by death, said the snake, eat the fruit. What could possibly go wrong? So that's not exactly a new development. I mean, the Bible is kind of an 80-book warning against this. Pretty much every other religion has its own cautionary tales about exactly the same thing. Once you reject God, you are fated to try and replace him. That's what happens all the time. Plenty of Greek myths about that. So this is where our path's leading us, and I think it's why the waters of the age feel so disturbed, why everything feels so weird. It certainly does to me. Transhumanism, artificial intelligence, the transcending of everything from biology to gender, the growing of food and babies in labs. We're very openly now seeking to break all the limits, remake nature, build the world anew. We're building this new digital Tower of Babel. And all the people responsible for that, interestingly, are very open about what they think they're doing. So I read an interview with transhumanist Elise Bohan, who I know that Mary's had a conversation with here. In The Guardian a few months ago, Lise Bohan's a great transhumanist advocate, and she was telling a story of how she presented a paper at a conference once, and this biologist came up to her afterwards, and she says, he looked me in the eye, and he whispered to me, "We're building God, you know." And I looked back at him and I said, "Yeah, I know." There's a reason that Christianity kind of really hones in on the importance of humility, by the way. So, Martine Rothblatt. Martine Rothblatt is another transhumanist ideologue who's created her own religion, by the way, called Terasem. His own religion. I get that confused because I can never work out which way around it's gone. His only religion, which is called Terasem, which says at the heart of the claim of Terasem is that God is technological and can be created by humans. But anyway, Martine, formerly Martin Rothblatt, claims we are making God as we are implementing technology that is evermore all-knowing, ever-present, all-powerful and beneficent. Geoethical nanotechnology, whatever that is, will ultimately connect all consciousness and control the cosmos. So that'll be nice. Looking forward to that. Or Ray Kurzweil, the granddaddy of the singularity, head of engineering at Google. These are the people who design everything we use all day, right? These are not fringe figures. Ray Kurzweil, when asked, "Does God exist?" replied, "I would say, not yet." So let that sink in. So go back to where I started to look at that origin story again, and you could say that transhumanism is the silicon manifestation of this new faith, that is the faith of the world, and it aims not so much to eat from the tree of life as to genetically engineer a new one and then plant it wherever the hell we like. So this is a revolution. It's a revolution, and it's going to make the Enlightenment look like a tea party, I think, and the entire basis of reality is being rewritten. There's nothing that can be agreed on. There's nothing that's sacred. There's nothing that's real. There's nothing you can't change. Nothing you can't make new. Got whole generations growing up with a much closer relationship to screen-based symbols than to manual work or the natural world. Convinced that the world is our playground and everything from history to human nature to sexual dimorphism can be changed if you feel like changing them, and then change them back again if you want to afterwards. So we are consciously making ourselves post-human. We're consciously making ourselves post-human now, even as we strive to make the whole world post-natural and post-wild. And so if the age that we live in is starting to take on the flavour of a war over the meaning of reality itself, which is to say a religious war, that's because it is. That's because it is, I think. So in that context, what can we conserve? I'd say nothing, actually. Nothing. In a culture that doesn't agree that nature exists, or that we had some basic shared assumptions about reality, the question almost doesn't make sense, because conserving something assumes some kind of understanding of what the good is, what reality is, what history is, what your culture is, what the sacred is, anything. And we haven't got that anymore. So I think that the challenge actually now is not so much to ask what you can conserve or restore. You have to go much further back than that. You have to dig down to the foundations. So the challenge now, I'll just end by throwing this out there. You can see what you think. The challenge now is not to ask what you can conserve or restore. The challenge now is to choose your religion. Okay? Now, if you don't choose, try and avoid that challenge, your faith will be chosen for you, and you will be absorbed by default into the new creed of the new age, which is the attempt to build God and replace nature through technology. That's the path of the snake, little snake, still there. So what can you do when there's nothing left to conserve? The answer is pray. I'll leave you with that.